Does this guy look familiar to you? If you've seen the movie Casino, he played Wiseguy. You remember. He was looking for Carmine.
You're over here? Yeah, looking for Carmine.
Well, maybe you remember him from Goodfellas.
Nicky Eyes.
What's up, guy?
Regardless of what character you may know him as, his real name is John Manca. And according to this book, prior to becoming an actor in the entertainment industry, he was once a crooked police officer who made the journey from the NYPD to the MOB. So who is John Manca? And how did he go from the NYPD and the MOB to starring in two of the most iconic Mafia movies of all time? Let's find out. I'm your host, Tony Handsome, and this is Corruption Connection. John Manca was born on August 23, 1930. He grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, above a fish store located on First Avenue, between East 13th Street and East 14th Street. The fish store was owned by his grandfather, a Sicilian immigrant named Frank Lucicero. Lucicero was born in Palermo in 1885, and early on had dealings with both the Sicilian and American Mafia. Ironically, in the same building as the fish store he owned, and directly across the hall from his apartment, lived the one Salvatore Lucania, also known as Lucky Luciano. John would say that his grandfather and Lucky were good friends. Despite Lucky being much younger than John's grandfather, he commanded respect and was feared in the neighborhood, even at that time. At the behest of Lucky's mother, Rosalie Luciano, John's grandfather would give Lucky a job in the fish store he owned. It was said Lucky did work there, when he felt like it, of course. John would recall meeting the boss of bosses at the age of 6, when he attended a funeral with his grandfather for one of Luciano's crime family soldiers. John would describe Lucky's face as being very scary, with a menacing scar on his cheek. He would go into detail on the interaction. Lucky asked me if I was a good boy, and I froze. He gave me a gentle 3-finger slap on the cheek and said, "You be a good boy, and always do what your grandpapa tells you." Despite freezing up, John took Lucky's advice with a grain of salt, as his relationship with his grandfather wasn't always the best. John would describe his grandfather as a very physically abusive man. He would go into detail on how he received regular beatings, and it was a toss-up between his grandfather and his mother on who would be belting out the punishment. Lucky wasn't the only mob connection John's family had. It was said that his father had a restaurant on 108th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, and ran a bookie operation in a territory at the time controlled by Anthony Tony Bendestrollo, a powerful mobster assuming the position of underboss in what would later be known as the Genovese crime family. Tony Benz would disappear on April 8, 1962, while leaving his home in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and was never seen again. It was evident from early on that John's life was mapped out for him. His temperament and family connections to organized crime would have a significant influence on him and would deeply impact his life in the years that followed. Like every young man coming of age, John was conflicted on where he saw his life going and worked odd jobs trying to figure out his path in life, but nothing stuck. With his mother and father on his back to find work, John reached out to one of his mob contacts and asked for help. The mob obliged, and John's first foray into organized crime came a few days later, when he accompanied a local mob leg breaker to threaten a shopkeeper who was moonlighting as a bookie and trying to end his arraignment with the local mafiosi. John stood as a lookout while the mobster threatened and menaced the shop owner, eventually shooting off a round from his gun, striking a payphone. Although shaken up and left uncomfortable, John remained steadfast and completed his first job working for the mob. He'd done well. Even though John proved himself in the eyes of the mob, there was something that just didn't sit right with him after the whole ordeal, and he decided to go straight. Or so he thought. Over the next few years, John would try his hand in a few different professions, most notably an IRS agent and then an order clerk for a brokerage firm on Wall Street, but nothing stuck. Feeling disenchanted with the idea of a regular job, John began to ponder his next move. While racking his brain on how to get ahead, John ran into an old friend from the neighborhood who went by Kenny. Kenny was a retired cop who came from the same neighborhood as John and was always on his case about taking the police exam. John was conflicted. On one hand, he hated the idea of rules and regulation which governed being a cop, but on the other hand, he loved the idea of sticking it to his abusive grandfather and family by becoming a member of law enforcement. This became a source of chagrin for John's grandfather, as he hoped John would use the family's connections to the underworld and land a job within the world of organized crime. John finally relented and took the exam. In 1954, at the age of 24, John Manca was sworn in as a New York City police officer. However, what was supposed to be a burgeoning career in law enforcement quickly turned into the exact opposite. Three hours into the job, and I was already dealing with corruption. John's first assignment was walking the beat in what he referred to as Wiseguy City. You couldn't go half a block and not pass a place that wasn't somehow connected. John describes his first day as a cop as being positive and uplifting, except for one minor detail. Everyone was corrupt. From the cops, to the detectives, to the supervisors, to the captain, everyone was on the pad. Being on the pad was cop slang for payoff lists. Policemen would avoid certain establishments on the list because they were being paid to ignore illegal activities taking place. As far as John could see, everyone was on the pad. I was a very happy cop walking my beat that first day. Then the sergeant drove up and warned me off a card game. I spent the rest of my tour wondering about that. A card game didn't bother me. If I had found out about it on my own, I wasn't going to bust it. A card game was no big deal. But getting paid off to ignore it was something else. I didn't want to be put in a position where some wise guy was pushing money in my face. 3 hours into the job, and already I was dealing with corruption. The conflicting battle of morality swirled around John's head. He thought to himself, I became a cop so I wouldn't have to be a criminal. But the reality on the beat was much different. Feeling a bit frustrated and confused, John would seek solace in his old neighborhood friend Kenny, the man who recommended him joining the police department in the first place. Kenny's response was as such: as long as the money is from gambling and not from drugs, you got no problem. Take it. Everyone else does. And just like that, a dirty cop was born. John would use Kenny's rationalization for corruption as justification for about every criminal act he committed while on the force, ranging from petty shakedowns to elaborate extortion scams. One of John's most secure methods for getting away with the money he extorted on the beat was a self-addressed envelope. As per his mentor Kenny's advice, John would always carry a self-addressed envelope while on the job. That way, if I made some money on the side, I could stick it in an envelope and drop it in the nearest mailbox. If any bastards from Internal Affairs were to stop me, I wouldn't have any money on me to incriminate myself. After just 7 weeks on the job, John was an expert at corruption and how it worked on the street, even noting that a handshake from a wise guy was worth $10. Life as a New York City police officer was playing out better than John had expected. Due to his connections, and after only a year of walking the beat, lining his pockets with dirty cash, John Manca was promoted to the rank of detective. And in 1950s New York City, having a gold shield was a legitimate license to steal. The more money I made, the more I spent at the track and restaurants and nightclubs. Making money with my gold shield became completely second nature, like it was my right. John was living life on his terms. He would sometimes hold court at the Garden Terrace, located at the Belmont racetrack on the Queens-Nassau County border. John liked to think of himself as the Don of Belmont, as he sat at his table and presided over a cast of characters, ranging from made men and half-wise guys to con artists and street hustlers. It was at these meetings where John would find himself being pulled even further away from the shield and deeper into the world of organized crime. One day while holding court, John would run into an old mob pal of his who informed him that there was a birthday party John should attend on Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem. It was for a wise guy that John knew. The wise guy was a member of the previously mentioned Anthony Tony Bender Strallo's crew. Upon arriving to the party, John would state, "It was held in an Espresso club on Pleasant Avenue. The place was closed to the public that night, and it was loaded with wise guys and negumadas. It was so crowded you could hardly move. I was hoping to meet a few people and let them know we could do business." John got exactly what he was looking for. A chance encounter on Pleasant Avenue with then-powerful Gambino captain Paul Castellano, brother-in-law to Don Carlo Gambino, head of the New York crime family which still bears his name to this day. Despite meeting Big Paul, no one took John up on his offer, and his plans for a potential business venture with the Mafia seemed at a standstill. Not deterred, John pushed forward and eventually established a working relationship with organized crime. The word was out. John had tin for sale, and the mob was buying. Being on the mob's payroll had its benefits. John, being a true meat eater, was racking in so much money from his pad that his regular paycheck from the department didn't mean much to him at all. It was petty cash. At this time, John was living a very lavish lifestyle due to his pad and work for the mob, that he bought his family a house in Whitestone, Queens. One of John's favorite pastimes was gambling. After several trips to the Atlantic City casinos, living lavish and running scams, John had his sights set on the bright lights in the desert. Las Vegas. In the summer of 1960, John would visit Las Vegas for the first time and fall completely head over heels for the gambling mecca. John would take several trips to Las Vegas over the next few years, living the life of a high roller, staying at famed hotels such as the Aladdin and the Dooms. I felt at home in Vegas, right off the bat. I loved the nonstop action. I'd play in the casino, relax at the pool, have a good dinner, see a show, and then go back to the tables. If I was lucky, I'd have a female companionship, usually somebody I met out there. You don't hang out in Vegas to be lonely. I'd fly out for weekends, sometimes when I was scheduled to work. If anyone in the squad asked where I'd been, I'd say working a case, but mostly no one asked. While spending so much time playing the part of a wise guy, John's workload took a back seat, and his career as an NYPD detective began to suffer. After a dust-up with his direct supervisors over his absenteeism and association with no members of organized crime, Manca was transferred away from the Precinct Detective Squad, and just like that, his gravy train of dollars generated from his pad had dried up. Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this video, please click the like button below and make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you would like to support the channel further, please hit the super thanks icon, which can be found below each video or in the comment section below. If anyone is interested in becoming a connected member, click the join button to gain access to rare pictures of organized crime figures, untold stories, and exclusive behind the scenes footage. Thank you. Now let's get back to Corruption Connection. Manca was now assigned to the homicide unit, a unit with no day-to-day interaction with Wiseguys and very little earning potential. John was on the balls of his ass, as he would call it. He needed a way to make money and maintain the lifestyle he had grown so accustomed to throughout his years as a detective. He would describe his sinister and criminal ways in almost a comical sense. It never occurred to me to go straight. I'd gotten used to the good life, and I wasn't going to give it up. Playing it straight was strictly for suckers. Things had gotten so bad once or twice, I went into fancy apartment houses and rode the elevators until some rich-looking guy got on. Then I'd take my gun out and rob him, throw him off the elevator before it hit the lobby. One time, a middle-aged guy ran down the stairs and chased me for 3 blocks until he finally gave up. All the time he was yelling, "Police, police." I kept thinking he'd bust an artery if he ever found out the guy who just ripped him off was one of New York's finest. John would perform several stick-ups and muggings in order to line his pockets. His behavior was out of control. Even for a crooked, dishonest cop like him, this was crossing the line. You reach a point where you always think there's another con right around the corner. You think you're untouchable, that no one's going to catch you. Once you start thinking like that, you're finished. It's just a matter of time. John's wily and brash behavior caused him to be transferred again. Upon his new precinct assignment, he would meet a car thief and career criminal known as Dave Cadillac, who got his name for his affinity of stealing Cadillacs. Cadillac would essentially be the catalyst for John Manca's exit from the New York City Police Department. After a few successful capers together, John and Dave concocted a scheme involving faulty registrations on the Cadillacs he stole. However, Dave unknowingly sold one of the stolen Cadillacs to a woman who worked for an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn. An investigation was opened, and Dave Cadillac was arrested. The first words out of Dave's mouth, "I'm a really good friend of John Manca," hoping it would gain him some leniency with the arresting officer. Dave mentioned John's name, and instead of helping his own case, he directly implicated John in his criminal activities. John was immediately stripped of his detective shield, and about a week later, on July 31st, 1963, was terminated from the New York City Police Department. He had been a cop for 9 years. The loss of his job as a detective within the NYPD didn't dawn on John until several months later. He was now broke, working at a deli, and blackballed by nearly all of the cops and mobsters he had done business with in the past. He needed a lifeline. That lifeline would come in the form of a mobster named Matty the Horse Ianniello. Matty the Horse was a powerful captain in the Genovese crime family, described as a kingpin and hulking capo. Ianniello controlled over 80 restaurants and ran sex bars, massage, and porno palaces. John's in with Ianniello was a soldier in the Genovese crime family by the name of Bobby, who was in Matty the Horse's crew. Through Bobby, John began strong-arming debtors and collecting debts on behalf of Matty the Horse. Although suffering one of the worst setbacks of his life, being kicked out of the department, John's life seemed to be bound for a resurgence. He was back in the good graces of the mob and had enough money to start a home renovation business, thanks to his renewed relationship with Matty the Horse Ianniello. John would reestablish himself as an earner for the mob, eventually winding up under the control of a soldier in the Colombo crime family. Being with the mob was even better than having a gold shield. I was free to explore my own scams, while at the same time benefiting from my connections to the Colombos. John was an expert at benefiting from his mob connections. He'd done it all his life. In one particular instance, John received the blessings from both the Colombo and Genovese crime families to rip off $200,000 from several Las Vegas casinos, a crime which he eventually got away with. But as I always say, all good things must come to an end. $200,000 seemed like a big score, maybe enough for John to call it quits before it was too late. However, like most criminals who'd get caught, his mentality was just one more. That one more turned out to be the biggest score of John's criminal career. $613,000 worth of American Express traveler's checks stolen from Newark Airport. It in fact was not only John's biggest score, it would be his last. John's crimes eventually caught up to him, and he was arrested by the feds. On January 18, 1985, John was arraigned at Brooklyn Federal Court for his involvement in the stolen traveler's checks. On March 1, 1985, he was sentenced to 3 years at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary and would begin serving his sentence on April 9th, that same year. This was John's first prison stint. Upon sentencing, John immediately looked for a way out. The ever-present idea of cooperating lingered in his head, but he couldn't. He knew that if he ratted on the mob, his life wouldn't be worth much anymore. He contemplated and then made his move. John concocted an idea. He would reach out to the feds and say he wanted to cut a deal, which would get him immediately transferred out of Lewisburg Penitentiary. Once transferred, John would renege on his deal with the government and refuse to testify. John would get word out to his Mafia cohorts about his intentions, which were received with mixed signals by his partners in crime, but eventually given their blessing. John was transferred from Lewisburg to Manhattan Correctional Center's 11th floor, also known as the Wiseguy wing, where he would encounter some notorious underworld figures, such as Carmine Persico, boss of the Colombo crime family, Anthony Colombo, son of assassinated mob boss Joe Colombo, and Anthony Indelicato, one of the triggermen in the hit on Bonanno family renegade boss Carmine Galante, son of slain Bonanno capo Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato. After a game of cat and mouse with the U.S. attorney and his testimony, both law enforcement and organized crime became wary of John. Although he had the mob's blessing, it seemed as if more and more of the rank-and-file wise guys were avoiding John, a clear sign of danger. His suspicions were confirmed. John was given the heads up by an old crony that a made guy was talking to a couple black prisoners who worked for Nicky Barnes, the Harlem drug kingpin. The topic of conversation between the three men? John Manca. He knew his days were numbered. John immediately asked to be placed in segregated confinement, a unit for inmates concerned for their safety. In the segregation unit, John would run into Willy Boy Johnson. Willy Boy, a close friend and associate of John Gotti, had been revealed as a long-time FBI informant. John remembered Willy from the street. He recalls an incident at Geffkens bar in Canarsie. Willy Boy, sitting with some guy at the other end of the bar. The conversation getting louder and angrier until suddenly Willy Boy grabbed the guy by the back of the head and slammed his face against the top of the bar, breaking the guy's nose. It was hard to believe now that Willy Boy had been a rat all these years. Although Gotti assured Willy Boy safe passage in exchange for not taking the stand against Gotti, he was rewarded with being shot to death in a hail of 19 bullets. John knew his choices were limited. He was placed in front of the grand jury and testified. Upon testifying, John was transferred to the third floor, the Rat Wing, where he would encounter several notorious mob turncoats, such as Fat Allie Merolla, a Colombo gangster arrested in 1981 alongside Anthony Colombo, a criminal powerhouse and heir to the crime family which his father began. In 1983, Merolla agreed to cooperate against Colombo in order to escape racketeering charges. John would also run into the likes of Matty Traynor, a career crook who testified against the Dapper Don John Gotti, but was later convicted of perjury as he was an unreliable witness. However, the most interesting character John would come into contact with in the Rat Wing was Luigi the Zip Ronsisvalle. Dubbed the Forrest Gump of the Mafia, Ronsisvalle earned the nickname because of his involvement in several major Mafia events throughout his history and life. Admitting to 13 murders before agreeing to cooperate, Luigi the Zip was a Sicilian immigrant brought over by Carmine Galante in order to protect the lucrative pizza connection, the Mafia's heroin trail that smuggled billions of dollars of the drug from Sicily through Canada and eventually to the United States by way of pizzerias during the 1970s and 80s. Details and exploits of Ronsisvalle's life can be found in the book Homicide is My Business, Luigi the Zip, A Hitman's Quest for Honor.
In the Rat Wing, John could do nothing but sit back and contemplate his life. The days of riding down the Las Vegas Strip, walking into the Baghdad Theater at the Aladdin, or gambling at the Dunes was a distant memory. He had sunk into an all-time low.
On September 16, 1986, John was released to a halfway house in Norfolk, Virginia. Despite the government not using his testimony, John was wary of his old mob contacts, even though he had caused them no harm. However, he was confident his whereabouts were unknown as far as the Wiseguys were concerned. John was safe. However, there was one problem. He was safe, but broke. Things didn't work out as planned in Virginia, and John thought of only one thing, his return to New York. This wouldn't be as easy as it seemed. John wasn't entirely sure how the mob would react to his return, but nonetheless, he was going back. John's return to New York City was accompanied by mixed feelings from both John and the mob. His former friends wanted nothing to do with him, and the mob didn't want to be within 10 miles of me, he stated. Destitute and contemplating his next move, John thought about how much money he made in his criminal career. More than $2 million, and now had only $290 to his name. A far cry from the years when he had his gold shield and owned New York City. On a chance occasion, John was introduced to Nick Pileggi by a mutual acquaintance. Nick wrote about the mob. His book Wiseguy detailed the life of Henry Hill, a turncoat Lucchese crime family associate. Wiseguy had become a bestseller and was the basis for the iconic film Goodfellas. Nick and John hit it off. Nick was familiar with John's involvement with the mob, his life of crime as a cop, and immediately offered him a job as a technical advisor. While on set, John was introduced to all the cast and characters, including the film's director, Martin Scorsese. Marty Scorsese asked me if I wanted to be in the movie and play a Wiseguy associate of Henry's named Nicky Eyes. I said yes right away. The job as a technical advisor and actor was a gift from heaven as far as John was concerned. He was free of a life of crime, and for the first time in his life, he had some money saved. In the following years after Goodfellas, John would perform odd jobs and continue to work as an actor, landing a role in the 1994 film Fatherhood, starring Patrick Swayze. This would eventually lead to John being casted in another Scorsese mob masterpiece, Casino, where alongside Joe Pesci, he plays Wiseguy Eddie and delivers one of the most iconic one-liners ever uttered in a mob movie.
Come on, John.
So, have you ever heard the story of John Manca, the Mobster Cop turned Hollywood actor? Let us know what you think in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another episode. As always, I'm your host, Tony Handsome, and this is Corruption Connection.